For 3 years, Oliver and I lived together, our connection strictly physical with no emotional attachment. We would sometimes sleep in the same bed, but there was never any affection or romance between us. Then, one day, I inadvertently walked in on him and his assistant in a situation that left little doubt about their closeness. Recognizing the reality of their bond, I chose to discreetly step away. That evening, as I was leaving, I sent him a text message as a farewell. "I'm heading back to my hometown to get married. Let's not keep in touch anymore." Later, I saw off my arranged marriage partner, and when I turned around, I met Oliver's gaze. He could no longer maintain his composed and rational facade, losing control as he cornered me against the wall. What does he have that I don't? Money? Power? Or is he just better at satisfying you? As the workday ended, a sudden downpour started. My colleague Emily had forgotten her umbrella and approached me to share mine. I didn't refuse. As I opened the umbrella, I heard Emily speak enviously. "Being an assistant has its perks. Proximity gives you an advantage. Jane, the new assistant, has only been here for 3 weeks and is already sharing an umbrella with Mr. Grant. In 3 months, we might all be calling her Mrs. Grant." I raised my eyes, my gaze cutting through the rain to focus on the 2 figures beneath a black umbrella. They were walking side by side, with Oliver striding ahead while Jane hurried after him. She lost her balance in her rush and nearly fell, but Oliver quickly caught her around the waist. The scene played out like a classic romantic drama on TV. I looked away, shaking the umbrella to send raindrops to the ground, creating ripples. "Aren't you leaving? If the rain gets heavier, we might not be able to later," I reminded Emily. Seeing that I wasn't responding, Emily poked my arm helplessly. "That's the successful and disciplined Mr. Grant, admired by everyone in the company. Aren't you even a little tempted?" She clutched her chest, putting on a dramatic look of anguish. "Anyway, seeing someone else in Mr. Grant's passenger seat breaks my heart." Emily's exaggerated acting made me laugh. I pulled out my car keys, pressed the button, and the lights flashed on the Audi parked by the roadside. I lifted her chin playfully and said with a smile, "You might not get to sit in Mr. Grant's passenger seat, but would you like a ride in mine?" Dropping off Emily took longer than expected. When I opened the door to my apartment, Oliver had just placed the last dish on the dining table. He was wearing comfortable loungewear, and the apron he had on seemed to be the couple's set the mall had given us last time we went shopping. Under the warm yellow light, the cold, impersonal aura that Oliver usually carried from his years in the business world had completely vanished, leaving only a gentle softness. Oliver walked over, took the bag from my hand, and hung it on the coat rack. He then bent down, took out a pair of slippers for me, and placed them at my feet. His fingertips naturally brushed against the ankle strap of my heels, spreading warmth to my cold skin. I stiffened and took a step back, refusing Oliver's help. "I'll do it myself." Oliver was slightly taken aback but said nothing. "I made your favorite pork rib and pumpkin soup. Go wash your hands and eat while it's hot." Silently, I changed out of my shoes and walked toward the sink. As the water flowed through my fingers, my thoughts drifted away. In the 3 years of living together, Oliver and I had crossed many lines. Helping me take off my shoes was just a minor thing. But just now, when Oliver leaned in, I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of resistance. I knew the reason, but I didn't want to admit it. It was because of Jane and also because of myself. In these 3 years, in the day-to-day routine that felt like a frog being slowly boiled, I had forgotten that my relationship with Oliver started as nothing more than a drunken fling, and that his kindness towards me was merely out of courtesy. I had fallen for him, confusing physical needs with love. Jane's appearance had jolted me back to reality. Fortunately, it wasn't too late to pull away. I ate that meal with little interest. After only a few bites, I put down my chopsticks and went upstairs to freshen up. When I came out of the bathroom, Oliver was waiting outside the door, his brows slightly furrowed and his gaze filled with concern. I didn't know how to treat Oliver at that moment, so I chose to ignore him. As we passed each other, Oliver grabbed my wrist. He held it tightly, as if trying to leave an indelible mark on my skin. "You today..." I sensed what Oliver wanted to ask, so I spoke first. "Do you want to do it?" A flash of surprise crossed Oliver's eyes. I didn't give him a chance to respond. Instead, I stood on tiptoe and kissed him. But gradually, Oliver took control, his palm pressing against the back of my head, deepening what started as a tentative kiss. Oliver couldn't even wait until we reached the bedroom, just a few steps away. He pushed me back into the bathroom. The humid steam still lingered in the air, and through the thin nightgown, I was pressed against the cold tiles, cold and wet. Oliver was the only source of warmth I could cling to. I had no choice but to wrap my arms around his neck, forced to endure everything he brought upon me. I bit my tongue, suppressing the tremor in my throat. It felt like a competition where the first to make a sound would reveal their hand and lose everything. I didn't want to lose so badly. Sweat dampened my forehead, and Oliver reached out to brush my hair aside. He lowered his head, lovingly kissing away the tears that spilled from my eyes. "Don't hold back. Call my name, okay?" There it was again. Oliver always did this, using a soft, coaxing tone to weave an illusion of love, making me fall deeper. Before the uncontrollable sobs could escape, I bit down hard on Oliver's shoulder. Even as I tasted blood, I didn't let go. Oliver groaned in pain, but then let out a helpless chuckle near my ear. "You really are a handful." In the end, I was exhausted. It was Oliver who carried me back to the bedroom. In a daze, I felt my left hand being gently caressed. I curled my fingers and asked hoarsely, "What is it?" Oliver didn't seem to expect that I was still awake. He cleared his throat, trying to cover it up, and intertwined his fingers with mine. "Nothing. Go to sleep." Everything that happened that rainy night faded with the clear sky. I had been on a business trip for over half a month, busy nonstop. I hadn't had the time or the mind to dwell on the past. So when I entered the passcode and opened the door, only to come face to face with Jane, I couldn't help but feel a moment of shock. Jane was wearing a lace camisole. I recognized it immediately. It was the one I had tucked into Oliver's wardrobe. Jane's eyes sparkled with delight, but upon seeing that it was me, her expression shifted to one of subtle hostility. She curved her lips into a smile and spoke in a hostess-like tone. "Miss Lynn, is there something you need?" I rubbed my temples, which were throbbing from exhaustion. I didn't scream at Jane, demanding to know why she was there, nor did I ask where Oliver was. I simply returned her a calm smile. "I'm just here to pack a few things, and then I'll be on my way." After living here for 3 years, I made several trips up and down to gather all my belongings. I even took the rose plant from the balcony that I had been taking care of, though it was Oliver who had been watering it all these years. Carrying bags upon bags, Jane gave me a sidelong glance and reminded me, "Miss Lynn, you should check carefully to make sure you haven't left anything behind." She lifted her chin slightly, a hint of sharpness in her otherwise innocent face. "After all, now that there's a new occupant, the old things should be thrown out. If you leave anything behind, you wouldn't want to go digging through the trash for it." The smile on my lips didn't waver. "Now that you mention it, I just remembered. There is one last thing I haven't taken with me." My gaze swept over Jane, my brow lifting with a hint of mockery. "The nightgown you're wearing is mine. Would you like to take it off and give it back?" "You—" Jane clutched her chest, her face flushing with anger. I had no interest in arguing with her, so I waved dismissively and said in a calm voice, "Never mind. I have a thing about cleanliness. Consider it a gift." I returned to the apartment I had rented before, carrying my heavy luggage. Even after moving in with Oliver, I never gave it up. Perhaps it's because I was too pessimistic, believing that everything with Oliver was nothing more than an illusion. Sooner or later, I would have to wake up from the dream. Fortunately, my pessimism allowed me to have a place to stay at this moment. I washed up briefly. Overcome by exhaustion from my non-stop work, I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up again, it was already evening. The endless darkness swallowed me whole. My heart suddenly felt empty, filled with an overwhelming sense of loneliness. It felt as though the world had abandoned me. Fortunately, that feeling didn't last long, as it was interrupted by the sudden ringing of my phone. I answered, and my mother's voice came through the receiver. Her words were nothing new. She asked the usual questions: if I was eating and sleeping well, if work was going smoothly, things she had repeated to me countless times over the years. I listened quietly, responding every now and then. In the end, my mother's gentle voice became tinged with a slight tremor. "Lily, are you coming home for the New Year this year?" So I wasn't sure why she was asking about New Year's plans so early, but I answered honestly, "I'm not sure yet." Why do you ask? There was a pause before she replied, "It's nothing. I just miss you. It's been so long since I've seen you." Her words hit me like a hammer to the chest. A wave of sadness welled up inside me. I came from a single-parent family. My concept of home had always been blurry. My childhood memories were filled with images of my father, idle and drunk every day. He had a bad reputation, indulging in drinking, gambling, and other vices. When he won, life for my mother and me would be a bit better. At least we wouldn't get beaten. But when he lost, it was different. He would take out his anger on my mother, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her into a dimly lit room like a butcher dragging his prey to the slaughter. The old house was in disrepair, and the door didn't close properly. At the age of 5, I was forced to witness my mother's suffering through a narrow crack in the door. Her anguished screams filled the room. While outside, I banged my hands against the door until they were bloody. I couldn't break the door open. I couldn't stop the torture that was happening inside. This went on for a long time, until one day, my father's clenched fist struck me. That was the day my mother, who had always endured, suddenly fought back. She grabbed a kitchen knife and swung it wildly. "You beast! If you dare touch Lily, none of us will live." Her hair was disheveled, and blood oozed from a wound on her forehead. She looked like a demon that had crawled out of hell. My father was startled and left, cursing under his breath. My mother put down the knife, her strength suddenly gone, and pulled me into her arms. Her tears soaked my hair as she whispered in a choked voice, "Lily, don't be afraid. Mom will take you away." After that, my mother single-handedly supported the two of us. She worked herself to the bone to provide for me. All I could do was study hard, work hard, and make a success of myself so she could enjoy a comfortable life. But over the years, I had been so focused on making money that I forgot what she needed most was my companionship. I glanced at my savings. The string of zeros was enough to let me live comfortably for the rest of my life. I no longer had a compelling reason to stay in the city. Once I realized this, I spent a week wrapping up my work and resigning from my job. The night I left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't even bring my suitcase. Just before boarding the plane, I sent Oliver one last text message. It was my way of ending our 3 years together. "I'm going back to my hometown to get married. Let's not contact each other anymore." With the burden of work lifted, my days back in my hometown were almost excessively peaceful. To keep myself from getting too bored, I built a small flower garden in the yard. Every day, I tended to the flowers and plants, finding a sense of contentment in it. However, my mother grew increasingly concerned by my quiet behavior. They say no one knows a daughter better than her mother. From the first day I returned, my mother noticed something was off with me. But she didn't ask anything. I didn't know how to start, so I just played along, pretending everything was fine. "Your Uncle Lee's son heard you were back and mentioned that it's been a long time since he last saw you." I was basking in the sunlight in the yard, half asleep. Hearing this, I opened my eyes halfway and responded vaguely. Seeing that I didn't show any signs of resistance, my mother was slightly relieved and continued, "I thought you two are both young, so you should have things to talk about. I accepted his invitation on your behalf. It's just a walk, a meal. You can't keep staying at home like this. You'll drive yourself crazy eventually." My mother spoke with a hint of concern. Knowing she had a point, I couldn't argue, so I agreed readily. "All right, I'll meet him." Jacob Lee and I were childhood friends. The night my father fled in terror, my mother gathered all our savings and took me on a green train. After several transfers, we arrived in the city where we live now. Jacob lived right across from us. His mother was a gentle person. When my mom was too busy to pick me up from school, she would take me along and invite me to her home. The first time I stepped into Jacob's house, my face was filled with anxiety. I was terrified of Jacob's father, even though every time I ran into him, he would greet me with a warm smile. But I still feared that in the next moment, he would clench his fist and grab me by the hair. None of what I feared ever happened. When Jacob's father saw me, he just patted Jacob on the back and said, "Your sister Lily is here? Why don't you take her to your room to play? Whatever treats or toys you have, you need to share with her, okay?" Jacob, who was the same age as me, took my hand and answered crisply, "Okay." That's the biggest difference between Jacob and me. He grew up surrounded by love, and he was even generous enough to share half of that love with me. It's been so long, and you really haven't changed at all. Still so quiet? A sudden cold sensation on my neck made me shrink back, frowning as I looked at the culprit. Jacob quickly offered a peace gesture. He handed me a cup, smiling as he sat down across from me. 4 Seasons Spring Macchiato. No ice, no sugar, with taro balls. I remembered correctly, right? It's your favorite. I took it, poked the straw into the bottom, and took a sip of the milk tea before replying, "You haven't changed either. Still as childish and talkative as ever." Jacob leaned back in his chair, his dark hair falling messily over his forehead, giving him a nonchalant look. "It's only with you, though. If I hadn't grown up with you, I'd probably be the cool, aloof type." Jacob sighed. "Unfortunately, you've always been an ice queen. If I were a mountain, it'd be hard to get more than 12 words out of you in 12 years. I smiled, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "How have you been these past few years?" Jacob continued to make small talk. "Pretty good. I'm practically living a retired life now. What about you?" After graduating from college, I worked as a wildlife photographer for 2 years, interacting with nature. But I got injured a while ago, and my mom was so scared she cried her eyes out. I couldn't keep worrying her. Jacob shrugged helplessly as he spoke. "So now I've had to give it up, and I'm planning to start a studio." "That sounds like a bit of a shame." I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow, teasing him. "But getting to experience the passion of starting a business at your age is like being 18 again." Jacob pretended to be angry and, catching me off guard, raised his hand as if to flick my forehead. I instinctively turned my head to avoid it. Jacob's hand hovered in the air, and the atmosphere grew tense for a moment. He then casually pulled back his hand, breaking the tension with a joking tone. "Forget it! This youthful heartthrob who's returned to 18 has nothing to say to an old-timer like you." Jacob and I walked around, stopping at several places we used to love. As evening approached, Jacob drove me back to my door. Just as I was about to say goodbye, he grabbed my hand. Jacob held my hand tightly and squeezed my palm. "Lily, the reason I asked you at this time was to tell you, I like you." I looked down at our intertwined hands, then back at Jacob's face. "When you filled out your college applications, you didn't choose Beijing. Instead, you went to another city because you saw the confession I wrote on the last page of my notebook, didn't you? That was your way of subtly rejecting me?" Jacob frowned, a flash of urgency in his eyes. "At that time, I thought you just couldn't distinguish between love and dependency, and that's why you had feelings for me. But later, I realized how wrong I was. The one who couldn't distinguish was me." Jacob looked down at me, waiting for my response. "You're right," I answered softly, gently pulling my hand out of Jacob's grasp. Back then, I really didn't know the difference between love and dependency. At that time, we were inseparable. You were the only one who took care of me, who treated me well, who shared everything with me. I hadn't experienced much love, so I naturally thought that was love. The words on the tip of my tongue spilled out with my trembling breath. But now I realize that love isn't about taking everything the other person has to offer. Love makes you foolish, even when you have nothing, even when you know the other person doesn't lack love. You still willingly offer that little piece of your heart. That's what love is like, neither entirely good nor completely bad. I paused, meeting Jacob's gaze with a serious look. "So you'll always be a brother to me. You were before, and that won't change." The evening breeze swept through, tousling the strands of hair around my ears. After a long silence, Jacob suddenly let out a chuckle. He tapped me lightly on the head with 2 fingers, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make me blink in confusion. "This long-winded speech about love actually came out of your mouth? I must have been mistaken about you. You haven't stayed the same. You've changed a lot. Tell me, who did you fall in love with? And why didn't you bring him back for your big brother to check out?" The tension eased. I didn't hide anything from Jacob, shaking my head and answering truthfully, "There's no chance for us." Jacob knew me well. He knew I wasn't someone who would say something so disheartening easily. Jacob didn't try to persuade me further. He simply brushed the stray hair back behind my ear and said gently, "It's getting windy. You should head inside." I watched as Jacob drove away. When I turned around, I found myself face to face with Oliver across the street. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, the faint glow of his cigarette flickering in the dark. A sense of helplessness washed over me. Despite living together for 3 years and sharing countless intimate moments, there was always an insurmountable distance between Oliver and me. Like now, I never even knew Oliver smoked. A cold wind swept by, carrying tiny droplets of rain. I shivered, ignoring Oliver as I walked past him. "Who is he?" Oliver suddenly spoke. "A blind date," I calmly replied as I entered the passcode. "Did you leave me to come back and marry him?" Oliver pressed on, his tone colder than the late summer evening breeze. I remained silent. Oliver took my silence as confirmation. He suddenly grabbed my shoulder, his grip tightening as he demanded, "What does he have that I don't? Money? Power?" I was backed against the wall, unable to retreat further. "Or is it that he's better at pleasing you?" Oliver leaned in closer, the harsh smell of tobacco assaulting my senses, making me even more alert. I met his gaze defiantly and said, "Did I not make myself clear in the text?" I calmly repeated the contents of my message. "Let's not have any contact for the rest of our lives." "Why?" Before I could finish, Oliver interrupted, his voice almost out of control. His grip on my shoulder tightened, causing a faint pain. I responded one word at a time. "Everything gets tiresome eventually. It's been 3 years, and I want something different. Is that so wrong?" With the final heavy rain, the summer heat gradually faded away. Oliver didn't appear again, and my life returned to normal. I was carrying a bag just a few steps out of the supermarket when a shadow suddenly darted toward me, causing me to stumble. The contents of my bag, bottles and jars, shattered on the ground. I frowned and looked up at the person. One glance was enough to make my body tremble uncontrollably. "Lily, your father has finally found you." A voice I hadn't heard in so long dragged me back to hell. Luis Lin was kneeling on the ground, tears streaming down his face. It was all my fault back then, and that's why our family was forced apart for so many years. But I've changed now. More and more people gathered around, attracted by the commotion. Such a young girl, yet so cold-hearted toward her own father. Even if her father was in the wrong, he's still the one who raised her. What can't be forgiven? As the subject of these whispers, my face turned as pale as a sheet. As a child, I had often dreamed of the day I would meet Luis again, but no matter the direction of the dream, it always ended in a bloody disaster. Luis was a deep-rooted sickness inside me. As long as he was alive, I would never find peace. My eyes fell on a shard of broken glass at my feet, sharp and small. If I cut Luis's throat, he would die quickly. Then everything would be over. I pressed down on my trembling hand, preparing to act. But before I could move, I was pulled into a warm embrace. Is scamming so brazen nowadays? Oliver's warm palm gently stroked my back, pulling me out of my daze. My girlfriend's father passed away recently. I watched with my own eyes as he was cremated. You jumping out now and pretending to be him is not a good look for society, is it? With just a few words, Oliver shifted the crowd's perspective. So he's a con artist. No wonder the girl had no expression. He must have touched a nerve. Poor girl, losing her father so young. Isn't this human trafficking? Call the police. Quickly, before he escapes and hurts someone else. Luis tried to argue, but when he heard the word police, his expression changed drastically. He scrambled to his feet and ran away. With the drama over, the crowd dispersed. "Are you okay?" Oliver held my wrist, looking at me with concern. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my gaze traveling from the cap on Oliver's head down to his clothes. When I noticed he wasn't wearing his usual suit, but instead a studded leather jacket, my eyes widened in surprise. "And what's with the outfit?" Oliver avoided my questioning gaze, his dark eyes flickering. "Just a whim, trying out a new style." "Oh." I didn't press the issue, turning to leave. Oliver called after me, asking, "Do you need help dealing with that man from earlier?" I shook my head, indicating that it wasn't necessary. "My problems? I'll handle them myself." I didn't tell my mom about Luis's appearance. I didn't want her to worry or live in fear, so I just told her that things were a bit unsettled lately and advised her to stay indoors as much as possible. At the same time, I reported the incident to the police. But their response was that without any tangible harm, there was nothing they could do. And besides, he was still my father. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Luis. "Lily, do you really think that hiding from me means I won't find you and your mom? If you push me too far, it won't just be text messages. Your mom is getting old, and she's already taken so many beatings to protect you. You wouldn't want her to live in fear again, would you? I know you have money. Give me $500,000 and I'll pay off my gambling debts. I promise I won't bother you anymore. After all, I'm still your father. You wouldn't really want to see me get my hand chopped off, would you?" Of course, I didn't believe a word Luis said. If he could extort me once, there would definitely be a second time. So I needed to think of a way to end this for good. After pondering for a long time, I typed out an address. "Meet me here tomorrow night. I'll bring the cash." As dusk settled, the time to meet Luis was fast approaching. I changed into something inconspicuous and grabbed the suitcase before heading out. When I arrived at the alley, Luis was already there, pacing nervously. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. I tossed the suitcase to the ground. It hit the pavement heavily, and bundles of cash spilled out. Luis immediately dropped to the ground to gather them. The streetlights in this alley were old and dim, casting a foggy glow. Even so, it was enough to illuminate the greed in Luis's eyes. "Dad knew you'd come through. With this money, I can finally turn things around." Luis counted the bills, a layer of giddy joy clouding his face. I watched him in silence and let out a small laugh. As expected, my laugh caught Luis's attention. He looked at me warily. "What are you laughing at?" "I'm laughing at how foolish you are," I replied. "Did you really think I'd let you control me? 50,000? It's more than enough to get you in deep trouble for extortion." I spoke calmly, but Luis's face changed instantly. His voice trembled as he shouted at me, "I'm your father! You owe me this money!" Unmoved, I continued to provoke him. "Is that so? Save that line for when the police get here." Luis gritted his teeth, a violent rage bubbling up. "You little brat! How dare you call the cops? I should have beaten you to death back then." A crazed look flashed in his eyes. I knew Luis had lost his mind. He was on the run, his nerves constantly on edge. Any slight disturbance could